Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now at the very last poem of the collection called Autumn Rivulets. The Prairie States is the name of this one. Poem number 38 of the 38 of Autumn Rivulets. You have finally arrived now at the end of another collection of poems, which is really cool. We've reminded ourselves that autumn can symbolize the old, rivulets, the new, that which flows out of the old. And we're going to see some of that going on here, no question. Now, some have pointed out that in a notebook, the observation was made that this poem may have something to do for those who are engaged in the Irish famine, and that makes this kind of an interesting poem to read. Of course, as well, let's point out that the biography of Whitman tells us that he took a trip out west to Colorado in 1879, and a whole lot of this poem is going to be motivated by that. This is a fascinating poem to me for Whitman to finish his Autumn Rivulets with, and we'll maybe at the end ask, why would this end up in Autumn Rivulets, and why would it be the last poem in Autumn Rivulets? In earlier collections, right, we've asked, why is the last poem the last poem? And even in sections like 52 of Song of Myself, we've asked, why does it always end up last? There's a lot of intentionality in Leaves of Grass, and I think we're going to see that in this poem as well. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net from that very first word come, the invitation word, up through and including all the inscriptions poems, Song of Myself, we just mentioned. And we gave a set of introductory comments to Autumn Rivulets that I'm hopeful that as well you've already exposed yourself to. And we just finished with my picture gallery. Now, our Nortons will tell us about this poem, that it was that this poem was the manuscript for this poem dated from Camden, March 15th of 1880, and was published in facsimile in the Art Autograph, May 1880, having been sent there, according to Whitman's manuscript note, on an earlier manuscript copy, quote, for the Irish famine. The poem was first collected in Leaves of Grass in 1881. Now, we're going to be playing with lots of motifs here, no question. We're going to be playing with, as well, our Plato's Republic. We're going to be playing with Milton's Paradise Lost. And we're going to be talking about Eden. So we'll be messing around with any number of texts here. Now, you'll remember that the very first time Prairies gets used is in starting from Pomander 3, Chants for the Prairies, one of the early uses of prairies, at least in Leaves of Grass. The poem reads as follows. A newer garden of creation, no primal solitude, dense, joyous, modern, populous millions, cities and farms, with iron interlaced, composite, tied, many in one. By all the world contributed, freedoms and laws and thrifts society, the crown and teeming paradise, so far of time's accumulations to justify the past. Now again, I find this a compelling poem. And I want to make the argument that I think Whitman is reaching way back. I think he's reaching back to the Aeneid. I think he's reaching back to Aeneas' journey into the underworld and his conversation with his daddy Anchises, when Anchises said, this is what's going to make Rome so amazing. This is what is going to be all about law and all of that. I think he's reaching even further back to Plato and the Platonic tradition as we are talking about Republic and the question of justification. You'll remember Republic 10, 6, 17. The responsibility is with the chooser. God is justified, this idea of justification. And what is justice? We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net on Plato's Republic. Let's now work through the poem. And notice we'll begin by talking about a garden, but a newer garden. That is to say, the modern. So right away, rivulets will be factoring in here. Notice newer as opposed to the old garden, which is, of course, we could say any number of gardens. We could be talking, of course, about Europe, for example, as being a garden. Obviously, the biblical allusion is ever present here as well with Genesis 3 and the Garden of Eden. But obviously, we're as well going to think about Milton and his Paradise Lost, of man's first disobedience to the fruit of that forbidden tree which brought death into the world and all our woe. We've given full lectures on Paradise Lost at learnstrong.net for those of you who want to run that one to ground. A newer garden of creation, and all of a sudden it hits us. Yeah, you know what? It's true. Leaves of Grass, and especially Autumn Rivulets, has been a lot about creation. as opposed to drum taps, which was a lot about death, huh? And so you've got this kind of recognition that after the horrors of the war, we have creation that will arise, a newer garden of creation. But notice, no primal solitude. In other words, this is going to be a new kind of garden because there are not going to be walls around it. There's not going to be all these rules about who gets in and who gets out and all of that. Notice, he's going to talk about this garden as being dense. That is to say, full of life. That is to say, full of opportunity. And obviously, the natural resources are dense. Notice, I love that he uses Scooby snacks. Takes us back to Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and obviously the pursuit of Scooby snacks. Notice here it's joyous, and all of a sudden it hits us. This word joy or joyous has been used repeatedly through Leaves of Grass up to this point. But notice the next word, modern. Now that's an interesting word, and as we've said when we did our study of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus as the subtitle is, the word modern starts being used at around 1800 to mean what? Technologically advanced. So obviously modern. Notice populous millions, I told you about his love of playing around with large numbers, and then cities and farms. He's always joining the urban and the rural together. We've seen this number of times, haven't we, in our study. With iron interlaced, we're back to modern, the idea of technology. Of course, interlacing iron here would predominantly be what? Obviously our railroad system, right? Composite meaning coming together. Obviously that's the hope, given what drum taps is telling us happens during the time of the terrible war. Tied, and then he says it, many in one, quoting obviously the Latin line that will be significantly important in Whitman's view of what democracy is. The tension between the individual and the community. In our Big Five, the tension between psychology and sociology. That is to say, there's always the struggle for Whitman of celebrating both the individual and obviously the group to which the individual belongs. By all the world contributed. Now this is, of course, influences of Hegel and his idea of cultural evolution, and the idea that it is an interesting argument that everything historically has led to this moment in time, which is America. Notice the dash, reminding us of our Emily Dickinson, freedoms and laws and thrifts society. It is a three, by the way, it is a trinity, and it sounds a whole lot like, of course, Aeneid 6, that trip by Aeneas into the underworld. Again, we've given comments on all of that at length at learnstrong.net. Notice here the word thrift. I mean, we get freedom, and we get law. That idea, of course, is sometimes in tension, no doubt. But what's up with this word thrift? I think this is pure Whitman. Whitman wanted to make the argument that America is different from Europe in one primary aspect, and it is this notion of pragmatism, thrift. And this is why, of course, William James loved so much of Leaves of Grass. Notice he calls it the crown, which is fascinating because, of course, the British will use this term during Whitman's day in a much different way, the crown. And he says, by the way, the word crown here is the ultimate, right? The penultimate. And teeming paradise. In other words, constantly growing, constantly moving. He loves the word pictures, as we've seen already, of the honeybee and the bees in their comb. And it's teeming, it's moving, it's dynamic, in other words. Notice so far, in other words, there is this idea of evolution. It's ongoing, of time's accumulations. In other words, everything that's preceded is bringing us to this moment in time. For what? Notice the last line is the shortest line of the poem, and it is to justify the past. Now, Whitman's readers, because they had read Milton's Paradise Lost, would immediately get this phraseology of to justify. And again, the line, of course, from the opening lines of Paradise Lost, to justify the ways of God to men. That is to say, of our Big Five, the last one is theodicy. In other words, in some really profound way, we finish this collection of 38 poems with a theodicy. What was the point of all of the horrors that came before? Both, of course, in human history, as well as technically as well with the terrible War of the States. Notice it is the Prairie States, right? Well, I think the point that he's making is everything that happened was to come to the new garden, the new Eden. That is to say, America. Now, 2A, again, I think his argument here is that America in the end justifies all previous history. That is to say, out of the cultural chaos arises this newer garden, this crown, as we might call it, and for him that is America. At 2b, I love the symbolism of paradise, of Eden. And I love the idea that it might as well resurrect in the minds of some paradise gained versus paradise lost, okay? And at 3a, since we're there, obviously, think about the power of joining Plato to Milton in a poem like this. And the idea of, we're speaking about justification. In other words, all of the things that transpired that came before, they're all here for us, right here, right now. He's arguing to his present readership. Of course, autumn rivulets, and why is it here? Well, obviously he's looking backwards, and this is what all great artists do. We've said this about Whitman, looking backwards, but also always looking forwards, which is why Whitman's read so much today. I mean, you guys are commenting on this fact that as you're reading these poems, you see them as quite, can we use the word modern? Of course, we would probably argue post or even post-postmodern, but we still would use this idea of modern. In other words, there's something still to be learned here. Which takes us finally to 3b. How are we going to own a set of lines like this? Well, let's first of all just ask about the notion of Eden. And is America the new Eden, do you think? Is it still that? Is it still paradise? Or is it rather paradise lost in your estimation? Like, where do you come down on this? Do you still share Whitman's optimism? He said, I love to look on the sunny side of life. Do you still share his optimism that all of history has somehow brought us to this moment in time, this amazing moment in time? Is that how you see it, or do you see it rather as paradise lost? How do you read your own cultural history? And now we can ask about autumn rivulets, right? We've now read 38 more of these poems, and as you start to look, right, at the rest of Leaves of Grass, you begin to realize we are on, in fact, the downhill slant of reading Leaves of Grass. Yes, we are. We don't have that many poems now remaining, and it's kind of an amazing thing to ask now. Of all the poems in Autumn Rivulets, which one for you was the most powerful? Which one spoke to you? Which one was your favorite, and where did you enjoy reading it when you were reading it? From here now we turn on to the next set of lines that will be a poem broken up into several parts, Proud Music of the Storm. And I'm hopeful that you will continue to be challenged by this great American poet of paradise. Thank you.